Welcome to my Friday stream, everyone, or anyone who's watching. How are you all? I hope you're well. This one's probably going to be a moderately short one, depending on how many tangents I go off on. But I have some rather exciting news, or at least news that I think is rather exciting. This coming Wednesday, I will be having a very special guest, Dr. Anders Sandberg, on to talk about the Fermi paradox. That's the paradox between the fact that we, by many calculations, should have seen aliens by now, and the fact that we haven't encountered any. So, how to resolve that. He's written several papers on the topic, and it's fair to say that he's a world expert. And also, we'll be chatting about the kind of far future of space colonization and why and how humanity should and can spread out towards the stars. So that should hopefully be a little bit lighter and uh, more upbeat than the coronavirus stuff I've been doing on Wednesday and last Wednesday and today. But it's important to talk about, and if you're not in the mood for perhaps slightly depressing disease stuff, come back either Monday or Wednesday or both, and we'll have something a little bit lighter. Uh, but for now, the thing I wanted to talk about today is confidence in evidence regarding COVID-19. So this is something I was going to discuss last Wednesday, but the chat with Ollie kind of ran over, which was very entertaining, and I think he had a lot of interesting things to say. Go back and listen to that on the YouTubes if you haven't. But uh, this is all quite relevant stuff, so I thought it would be useful to get around to it. So I guess the most important thing I want to say is that over the last couple of months, with the coronavirus spreading and COVID-19 infecting more and more people, the thing that I've been perhaps most concerned about, specifically regarding the pandemic, is the fact that a lot of people, and this isn't just lay people, it includes journalists and even some scientists and medics, are reading a lot of information into very, very noisy data. Science is an extremely gradual process, and it's a process that relies on thousands, sometimes millions, of individual scientists around the world collaborating and building up knowledge slowly and reading what the others have written and giving feedback on that. And currently, the whole process of science has kind of been turned on its head. The rapidity with which evidence is coming out and people are trying to integrate it into the kind of body of understanding, the number of studies all addressing the same thing from a different angle, uh, it's making for very, very difficult analysis. And this isn't at all the fault of the scientists involved. They're in an extremely, extremely tricky situation. But a lot of the studies that have been addressing specific clinical questions regarding the coronavirus have featured things like a lack of randomization in their samples, retrospective analysis, and very small sample sizes. And while these might sound a bit esoteric to those of you who aren't scientists, these are all really, really extremely important factors in designing a reliable study. Normally, studies without these factors are kind of relegated to first approximations. You do a non-randomized retrospective study when you don't have anything else available, or when you're just trying to get the kind of first little bit of evidence that builds up into a larger picture over the course of years. Um, but currently we're dealing with these very, very tentative, small, limited studies that people are trying to infer way too much from. So without getting too deep into it, because I know a fair number of the people watching will probably be scientists, and this will all be uh, old news to them. But why is it important to have these factors? So I'm just focusing on these three. There's a bunch of other stuff to do with study design that is very much worth paying attention to, but pick these three out as a kind of example of some of the things that we're losing by not having better design studies. And again, that's not to say that the scientists are doing a bad job here or anything. They've had very little time to do these studies. Normally, just planning a well-designed clinical trial takes a year or more. Um, my fiance has been working on one, and I ran a small clinical trial. And even when you're dealing with, a handful of patients, a few dozen, it takes a huge, huge amount of effort. So it's certainly not a dig at them. So randomization in your sample. At the moment, with coronavirus patients coming in, COVID-19, patients coming in, most of the samples being taken for studies are just based on whoever they can get. The first 100 patients come through the door with vaguely COVID looking symptoms. Unfortunately, there's inherently going to be bias in that. The time of day that patients come in, the day of the week, things like the clustering of outbreaks, the fact that you might get one factory or school or whatever with a lot of cases all at the same time means that patients who come in at a similar time over the course of a few days are likely to share a bunch of characteristics. This is an opportunity sample. You just sample from whoever you have opportunity to do so. And that has a lot of limitations. It's likely to introduce a lot of biases into your sample, some of which you might be able to correct for. If you get a bunch of older people in at the same time, you can just focus on answering questions about older patients, or you can deliberately try to get some more patients who are younger and balance them out. But without proper randomization, without having a large population to choose from and deciding that using a random process, you are going to introduce these kind of biases that often you simply can't correct for, particularly when you're working with a smaller sample size. Because moving on to that, the larger the sample size you can get, the more chance you have of being able to ignore bits of statistical noise that don't actually mean anything or that are likely to mislead you. And you can drill down to a better approximation of the truth. All else being equal, larger sample sizes are pretty much always better. Of course, you've got economic limitations and so forth, but in this case, there are even greater limitations on what's available, on how many resources you have, on how many patients you can interact with, etc. So we are limited to these small sizes. And finally, you've got the fact that currently studies are all being analysed retrospectively. So what this means is, well, not all, but most of them, that patients are coming in, they're being treated however they should be treated according to the medical staff, and then a researcher or one of the doctors will go back over their case file and note down what happened and include that in a study. Whereas with a prospective study, you recruit people and you will typically randomize them into different groups for treatment based on certain objective criteria. You are picking them in a fair manner, using a randomization and picking from a big population, etc., in order to minimize the risk of bias creeping in. If patients being treated just on the basis of clinical uh, presentation and then retrospectively recording, there's a good chance that you're going to introduce some bias by, for example, if doctors are more likely to give a certain drug to, let's say, hydroxychloroquine, to particularly unwell patients and or particularly uh, promising patients, say, and they get better at a higher rate than the patients who got more severe invasive treatment, then it's going to look like, if you just do a simple kind of retrospective analysis, it's going to look like the patients who took the hydroxychloroquine were getting better more reliably because you've got two groups, one's doing better than the other, and one's taken this drug and one hasn't. And it seems that this approximately might be what happened in several of the hydroxychloroquine studies, as we're finding out now that maybe uh, maybe things weren't quite so promising and bias was introduced. And while that's fine for a regular drug, while that's fine for a regular study, we expect to be throwing out a lot of research attempts and not getting a lot back. The fact that it's touted by certain people as being a wonder drug has been a massive problem. And it's drawing those kind of strong inferences. Obviously, most people aren't as stupid as Donald Trump and aren't as likely to make quite such great leaps. But unfortunately, even the smartest of us can easily be misled by poor evidence. If you look at the list of Nobel laureates, you can go down them, and a worrying number of them have very, very silly views. Not to pick on any too much, but Kary Mullis, for example, very smart guy, came up with a new form of. Did he invent PCR? I think he invented the polymerase chain reaction. Um, Certainly refined it massively, at least. Anyway, big advance in chemistry and biology, but he doesn't think AIDS is real. He doesn't think it's caused by HIV, which is just insane. There's no evidence to believe this. It's completely fringe quack view, but he seems to genuinely believe this, and he's not the only Nobel laureate. So, and in the case of the kind of HIV conspiracy theories, that's all driven by this same kind of uh, lack of adequate evidence, the lack of respect for the real evidence that's been gathered carefully, and instead focusing on poorly designed studies that confirm what you want them to confirm, or on case studies, looking at individual patients and going, this person recovered after taking this drug or not taking this drug. Therefore, taking or not taking this drug has cured them. It's classic, post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy, but it's so easy to make, even for people, trained in the fields or trained in vaguely relevant fields. Kary Mullis is a chemist, not a medic, but still. Um, and we see the same thing with the more epidemiological studies of COVID-19. So studies looking at the overall case numbers are currently very, very limited and should be taken with a big old pinch of salt. Um, Working out how many cases there are in a population when we don't have reliable tests and we can't go out into the population as easily, and for some reason few governments have been willing to do proper random population sampling, uh, means that it's extremely difficult to get an actual handle on how many people are infected. So uh, this page that I've got up now, the USC LA County study, is a great example of how not to do reporting surrounding this kind of issue. So this study, you might have heard about it. It's a few days old now, but it's been touted as a great reason to believe that there are, excuse me, there are more people infected with COVID-19 than we previously believed, which would indicate that it has a higher transmissibility but a lower fatality rate. Which, if true, is probably good news. It's certainly good news from the perspective of herd immunity ideas, but unfortunately, the study is absolutely riddled with errors and limitations. So, in particular, they used, as I mentioned above, non-randomized samples. It was opportunity sampling based on a Facebook advert. They basically advertised for people to come and take a coronavirus test, which might, I think, quite plausibly select for people who are particularly interested in taking the test, say people who think they might have the disease. The test itself, the antibody test used, has a very high false positive rate, possibly somewhere in the region of 1 to 2%, which means that of the out of 100 people tested who don't have the disease, you're going to get one or two who are falsely labeled as having the disease. Now, that doesn't sound massive, but when the team working on this study is claiming that maybe 4.1% of the population have the antibody to the virus, i.e., have already had it, and we're talking about an error rate of a couple of percent, and when the margin of error runs from 2.8 to 5.6%, it's entirely possible that if 2% of these tests are giving up false positives, that maybe only 0.8% of the population has it. Alternatively, it could be, several percent. It could be above 4. So this study is basically, it's a bit crap, and that's not just the fault of the scientists. Again, we're dealing with extremely difficult questions trying to be answered very, very quickly. But the study hasn't been properly peer reviewed yet. The statistical methods used, though I'm not an expert in statistics, Amy kind of is, my fiance, and she has poor opinions about it. And yet, the study has immediately been put up for a press release by the County of Los Angeles Public Health Department. It's immediately been shared around the world as this very encouraging sign about the actual infection fatality rate. But it's incredibly premature to do so. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the study is wrong. There are, as I said, a number of criticisms. There are several other ways it could be underestimating. It's probably not in this instance, but it's plausible it could be. We just don't know yet. And it's that lack of knowledge that both understandably scares a lot of people, but it also drives people to grasp on for any information that they can find. And when people are publishing studies that haven't been peer reviewed, haven't gone through that process of checking, and nevertheless uh, are being um, touted as reliable by public health authorities, I just find that extremely concerning and honestly very irresponsible on the part of the health authorities and on the part of science-focused journalists who are not putting this into proper context. Ooh, I see we have a couple of things in chat. Um, so I think it's also important and interesting to talk about people reading a lot into the lack of evidence, given that this is a relatively novel event for our lifetime at least, i.e. Sweden's chief epidemiologist saying there's no hard evidence for quarantine and using that as a basis for not recommending it to the Swedish government. Yeah, I think that's an equally important issue, is the fact that because we haven't studied this phenomenon yet, we probably shouldn't expect to have a lot of hard questions. You know, with regards to quarantine, the last time we implemented anything like this on a global scale was the 1918, 1917, 1918 flu outbreak, which also, hey Ruth, um, which is more than a century away, past now. We just don't have any studies really looking at how international quarantines are going to work, and shutdowns of travel and so forth are going to work in a highly globalized world where we've got near supersonic jet travel as standard, where a sick person can step on a plane in Jakarta and be in San Jose, the same day. And in that kind of world, we just, if we haven't done the studies, how do we know whether quarantines work? But because there's no evidence, if you want to kind of make the argument that we shouldn't be engaging in these preventative measures on the basis of there being no evidence, then it just seems very circular and seems, as you say, exactly the same kind of problem as reading too much into very limited evidence. So we're seeing a similar thing with a lot of the studies looking at modeling the pandemic. So I'm sure pretty much everyone has heard of the Imperial College model that projected about 500,000 deaths in the UK and 2.2 million in the US. But sorry, that wasn't a dramatic pause. I just need a little bit of Coke to keep my blood sugar up. But that model is entirely based around the assumption that we're not going to do anything, which is obviously not true. Even the least competent governments have been doing something, and sometimes too much, though that's something I'll probably get to another day. Uh, in the case of the Imperial study, uh, it relied on a bunch of assumptions, some of which we all knew wouldn't happen, some of which are best guesses that we've just kind of got to roll with because we don't have any better, excuse me, any better information. So first of all, you had the fact that it assumed that there would be no intervention. This was worst case scenario if nobody did anything. Uh, it assumes a certain RO, a certain R0 replication rate, which is extremely complex. The replication rate of a virus isn't just set by its inherent structure or a simple relationship with the body, but is set by how humans, or how the vector, whatever is transmitting it, behaves, how densely packed their environments are, um, the differences in humidity and heat, though heat doesn't just magically kill the virus. Please don't go in a sauna and hope that, or a UV chamber and hope that it's going to treat it. I can't believe I have to say that, but we'll get to that in a moment. Um, and also the imperial model assumes no reinfection, which might be the case, but currently is extremely uncertain. Unfortunately, I've seen a lot of people treating these kind of models. There's one out of Washington State as well, treating them as some kind of crystal ball to divine the future of the next few months or years. but that's not what these models do, and it's another example of how both the general public is over interpreting limited evidence, and how journalists and institutions are failing people in providing them with the real picture. And of course, this allows bad actors like Trump to claim victory on the basis that there haven't been a million deaths yet, when nobody thought there would be. Um, and when the actual death numbers are still staggering and worrying, but misunderstanding about what these studies actually mean is giving rise to this mismatch, and giving rise to, I worry, bad perceptions about how this is being handled. So we've got a question from Sabrina on the part regarding poor methodology for the study, estimating percentage of people infected. Do you think that it's actually more harmful than useful to do studies like this that have a lot of holes in them, given the drawbacks of the methodology? We still don't have a reliable answer on the percentage, but we have a lot of hype about it. Is this better than waiting for a better study? I think that's an excellent question, and in in the ideal world, I would much prefer us to do all of the research we can and to get preliminary evidence and to make a rational Bayesian model, inputting, our limited priors and refining those as we get more and more information. That would be wonderful, and in that world, we absolutely should be doing as much research as possible as early as possible, and even if it's as rough as hell, we'll refine it, and that's all good. But unfortunately, we don't live in the ideal world. Excuse me. And in the world we do live in, you've got the LA Public Health Authority with their Facebook page and their Twitter page touting an extremely preliminary study, a study that I'm sure the authors would say is very preliminary. Indeed, I think we've probably got a quote in here somewhere that says that, deep, deep below the fold, of course, where everyone stopped reading. Excuse me. And in this real world, we have to deal with the fact that the public and news organizations are understandably absolutely famished for information. They want any information they can get. And there's a strong kind of first mover bias where the first piece of evidence to come out on an issue tends to be latched onto by the media and by the public, and then everyone takes that as the baseline, and it serves as an anchoring point, the cognitive bias of sort of cognitive anchoring, um, and then everyone compares further studies back to that original one, which, when the original one might be quite far off, indeed it's estimating a 28 to 55 times higher. Hello. Okay, apologies for that. I really need to keep this plugged in while I'm streaming. Okay. Yeah, the fact that the studies estimated a, at least 25 times higher rate than existing research does, that admittedly limited existing research, gives us reason to be perhaps suspect of the results, or at least cautious about implementing them. Uh, but this has been touted publicly, so now everyone's going to take this to be, gospel until we get something extra, and then the next study is going to have to kind of fight against the mental state of this first one. And the solution to this, I don't know. I think it's plausible that this current situation with studies going up on medRxiv. I'm not sure if everyone's familiar, uh, and being, getting preprints up and posted in newspapers uh, as if they're, robust meta-analyses. And I'm glad to see that medRxiv is putting this up. Preprints are preliminary reports of work that have not been certified for peer review. That's incredibly, incredibly important. Unfortunately, in this age of this very young age of kind of fire hose of medical information, not enough journalists and not enough pretty much everyone are paying attention to that little warning. Uh, so, as you say, Sabrina, we've got this kind of situation where very limited studies are being thrown out, even more so than than is typical on the internet. They're being thrown out and digested by the media and by people and the sort of lay people, and it's giving rise to real problems. So how we deal with that, I don't know. I think maybe we should pause all news for a month, and journalists can go to a course dealing with medical statistics and maybe learn some epistemology, and then they can come back refreshed and give us that reporting. But unfortunately, I don't think everyone's going to tolerate a couple of weeks without any journalism. And I don't want to just bash on journalists here. I don't want to bash on anyone. This is an incredibly, incredibly difficult situation with a lot of, science journalists who are normally relying on experts much more to make judgments, who are trying to have to pass through primary sources themselves. You've got all kinds of people in the media who are now being drafted in to work on complex medical topics when previously that's just way outside their experience. I have all the sympathy in the world for them because it cannot be an easy job. Um, and same with this kind of research. It's not that the University of Santa Cruz is a terrible school, or that the medics are incompetent, or the researchers are incompetent, or anything like this. It's that we're just not used to dealing with this kind of speed, this kind of situation. And yeah, Golden raised an important point here. Um, Gradually, we'll be able to adjust to this. Um, the current situation is that the media and the public is kind of calibrated to be dealing with papers coming in as relatively finished products, and there's always been a problem with the media kind of picking up on an individual study, or people debating online, finding an individual study that supports their point of view and then over-interpreting that. Like, that's just been a thing that's going on for ages and not something that's easy to deal with. But at least the media was calibrated around that kind of epistemic norm, and suddenly we've gone to a much higher rate of publication and a much lower level of confidence that we can have in each piece of evidence, but we're still kind of handling it as if each of these very tentative preprints is a fully peer-reviewed, robust journal article, which they're just not. Um, and I want to give a shout out to all of the people working in this research, because I've gotten papers out that have taken me a year of effort on and off to publish. I've gone through starting up studies that's taken months and months and months just to get the ethics approval, let alone setting up all the recruiting and setting up all the tasks. And there's just so much to do that the fact that we're getting any data out, you know, 2-3 months after the catastrophe has really kicked off is incredible, and utmost respect goes to everyone working in this. But the fact is that that kind of rush comes with downsides, and hopefully we'll gradually get a better handle on it. But right now we are we are not in the ideal place. So moving on a little bit, uh, it's not exactly the most cheery subject, but when it comes to the death toll of COVID, not that we've been having particularly cheery conversations so far, but when it comes to the death toll of COVID, there's again a lot of reporting errors, a lot of limitations that we just haven't dealt with yet. And those of you who know me know that I'm not exactly the biggest fan of the government. I've chilled out a little bit over the last few years, but nevertheless, um, I'm quite skeptical of a lot of government reports and of the good faith of people in government and so forth. But I see a lot of reporting about how the UK government is putting out lies about the death stats, or the big jump in nursing home fatalities is part of a cover up, and I just really don't buy that. The fact is that or if it is any kind of cover up, it's not a big systemic one. Um, Simply because it's really, really difficult to measure even something as basic as deaths. You would think that the death tolls are very reliable numbers. If someone has died from something, that's kind of a pretty binary state. You would think either you've died of coronavirus or you've died of something else. One might think, but unfortunately, that's very much not the case, especially when we are lacking basic testing procedures in order to check whether a deceased person had COVID at all at the time. And even if we can convincingly determine whether a person had COVID when they died, that doesn't necessarily mean they died of coronavirus. If the if this study is correct, and again it probably isn't, but if there is a radical undercounting of the number of people with infections, then we might expect to see a massive number of uh, of people who have died of completely unrelated disorders, but who show up as positive. Um, However, conversely, we might expect to see a lot of people who a brief autopsy would indicate have died of cardiac disease or organ failure or stroke or any of a number of disorders, but whose deaths were substantially hastened by the COVID-19. And when we're lacking testing capacity to check for active virus, check for antibodies, when we're lacking the ability to catch up with patients, to check in on them frequently at home, excuse me, and when we've got hotspots popping up all over the place with little ability to clamp down on it and little ability to infection tracing and all of that, then it's perhaps unsurprising that we could be getting very large variations in the number of deaths attributable to COVID versus normal causes. And the best way we can really assess this, ultimately we're never going to get a precise number of how many people have died from this. We can't expect that. If you go back to the flu of the early 20th century, the 1918 flu, we have very little idea how many people actually died in that. The estimates range by a factor of two or more, and even with modern epidemiology and modern contact tracing and all of these wonderful technological and social structures that we've built up to better protect ourselves, the best way of measuring how many people have actually died in this catastrophe will probably end up being comparing death rates of similar times of year in similar regions. And already we're seeing based on the preliminary research in this topic, we're seeing a pretty large jump in mortality across a wide range of sources. So we're seeing increases in cardiac deaths. If we look up, so the this story, you can see there's been fewer calls to hospital in New York. Where's the actual the specific one I'm looking for? Um, Here we go. Oh, let me access The Economist. Come on, I should really get a subscription. Right, there we go. So the cardiac arrest deaths in 2020 are vastly greater, and this is just in New York, but vastly greater than the equivalent time period in 2019. And this seems to be bearing out in various locales that the increased deaths from, or the increased burden on the healthcare system from the coronavirus is driving fewer people to go into hospital, is driving fewer resources available for uh, conditions we would have otherwise treated. And so it's not just the people who are literally dying of pneumonia, pneumonia subsequent to coronavirus, who are literally dying of immune cytokine storm or whatever. It's also all of the deaths that we could have averted had this pandemic not occurred. And the death toll in the end is going to be substantially larger than the tolls that we're currently seeing on worldometers or any of these other sites. Um, this is almost certainly a substantial undercounting. Uh, but that does mean that when counts get revised upwards, we need to bear in mind that it's not some big conspiracy, it's just updating limited evidence to the uh, uh, to be closer to true, to be closer to what the real world is. That's something I'm probably going to cover. So, talking about kind of political influence over evidence and how we should view the advice of experts, governmental organizations, just wanted to kind of quickly say that first, political influence doesn't make a source useless. Now, I've been thinking about this particularly in the context of the World Health Organization. Trump has, and a few people have accused the WHO of being in the pocket of China and being a political lapdog to China. And there is some truth in that. Like with most of Trump's insane, vaguely racially charged dog whistles, he has a little kernel of truth in there. But That's only because the WHO is inherently a political organization. It's a collection of healthcare professionals and administrators from most of the countries around the world who are working together to further the goal of global health. An organization, by the way, that has a tiny budget, um, that has a smaller budget than many hospitals, and yet is, uh, sorry, I think its annual budget is more than most hospitals, but still, you know, I'm going to double check that because I like to be accurate. Sorry. Um, come on. Sorry, I should have Googled this beforehand. Program budget 2020-2021. Oh, of course, they have to have massive bloody uh, PDF. No, do we not want to? Okay, I'll check this later, but the point is that the WHO's budget is relatively small from the point of view of, large intergovernmental organisations. Not quite as small as the Biological Weapons Convention, but nevertheless. Uh, okay, here we go. So the entire WHO budget that includes polio eradication, a variety of special focus programs on various disease areas, and the actual administration comes to less than 5 billion, and that's what they're asking for 2020-2021. So yeah, the approved program budget for 2018 to 2019 was 4.4 billion, 4.4215 to be precise, which for the premier organization taking care of the entire planet's health is trivial. There are hospitals that cost less to build than that, cost more to build than that, and there are I think the annual spending on ice cream uh, absolutely dwarfs that worldwide. There are so many things that we spend money on that get us far, far less bang for our buck than the WHO. Now, has China had an outsized influence on WHO considering their contribution to its budget? Yeah, sure, absolutely. But that's mainly because the US has, or one of the reasons for it is that the US has failed to fill a bunch of the positions of the WHO, um, has failed to adequately engage with it, and here we go. They failed to confirm a US representative to the WHO, the kind of head of the US delegation. They've failed to provide adequate funding. The US has been holding up some of the funding previously, and now Trump has decided to forego future funding in a bizarre statement. And yeah, the Chinese Communist Party has taken advantage of that lack of global leadership in order to carve out a soft power um, avenue for itself in the WHO. And yeah, that influence may well have had an impact on what the WHO was initially saying about the outbreak in Wuhan. But the fact that an organization can be politically co-opted isn't a compelling argument for dispensing with it altogether, especially when it's the only viable organization that is coordinating global health strategy in areas that we need to, not all fucking die. So I don't know. This is just something I've been becoming increasingly frustrated with. But the fact is that some political influence over an organization doesn't make that source useless. However, that also doesn't mean we should pay uh, slavish attention to the dictates of organisations that are under political pressure. Um, Not least because when we're thinking about governments and public health organisations and so forth, the advice that they give is very frequently coloured by the political realities that they're living in. So an example of this, which I just keep on wanting to kind of scream from the rooftops, is that the 2 meter guideline, the guideline for how far we should be socially distancing, or physically distancing, I think is a better term, but um, is kind of completely arbitrary. So 2 meters is based on research dating back to the early 20th century about the nature of droplets versus aerosols when you kind of cough or sneeze or speak. Um, you've got larger particles that don't travel as far but stay wet because it takes them longer to evaporate. You've got smaller particles that evaporate very quickly, but the kind of dry remains of them can potentially travel further. Now, the coronavirus was initially thought to travel almost exclusively by the droplets. It now seems that aerosol transmission is a bit more plausible, but also the 2 meter kind of approximate rule is based on just outdated recommendations, or outdated evidence. The current evidence indicates that with a fairly powerful sneeze, the particulate matter can potentially be ejected 8 meters or more. Now, that doesn't mean that the guideline should be 8 meters, because that's only under certain conditions. If you sort of sneeze in one direction and it's relatively still air, and we're just measuring for the smallest droplets and so on and so forth. But 2 meters isn't a magical barrier. It's not a magical shell around you protecting you inviolably, whatever. And I keep on seeing these pictures of people, standing in grids all exactly 2 meters apart, or in lines all 2 meters apart, and all of these kind of very regimented uh, arrangements. When a 2 meter gap is probably fine if you're just passing someone on the street, but if you're spending time near them, then they're going to be breathing in and out. The fluid dynamics of a sneeze or a cough or breathing are extremely complex. If you're in a confined space, it's going to be building up aerosol. And if you go to somewhere like a intensive care ward working with a whole bunch of coronavirus patients, the whole air is heavy with aerosols, with potentially infectious particles. Conversely, if it's a windy day and you've got a mask on, you're probably fine, standing right next to someone, because it's going to be blowing most of the particulate matter away. And so, why are they saying 2 meters? Ultimately, because a lot of public health advice comes down to what you think that the population will actually follow. If they're saying everyone needs to keep 5 meters away, that might be safer, but you can't pass anyone on the street at 5 meters. You can't make shops and so forth function at all at 5 meters. So there's always going to be a compromise. Um, but from an individual level, I wouldn't want to be standing within 2 meters of someone for an extended period of time, particularly not if they're coughing and sneezing. And we shouldn't individually take a rough kind of population health level guideline as being uh, the be all and end all of safety. So that's kind of my little nearly hour long rant about evidence in COVID. before I leave, I'd like to just cover a few kind of predictions. So, first episode way back on Monday, when I started this, I said one of the things I want to do with this is make a few predictions so that I can come back and kind of judge how accurate I've been, for to keep myself honest, because I often say, and I've been experiencing this a lot in the coronavirus pandemic. I often say to myself, "Oh God, I predicted this. I saw this coming. A year ago, I definitely said this, and it's come to pass." But over the last 18 months, 2 years, I just haven't been recording anything, so I have no way of proving that either to myself or to anyone else. So I'm going to make a few predictions here that anyone can come back and tell me I was massively wrong. Um, so first few obvious ones, uh, the boom in teleworking, Zoom conferences and so forth, and the decreased international travel are not going away anytime soon. I think these are going to be absolutely the new normal, not least because they're more economically efficient in many regards than, flying three people business class halfway across the world to have a, 1 hour meeting that you could get at least 95% of the effect of if you were just doing it remotely. I think that's a pretty no-brainer, and to some degree, it was just institutional inertia that was keeping people from relying more on telework and on remote meetings. Um, and I would kind of hope this does stick up, not least from the keep up, not least from the point of view of the environment. For all of the bullshit, oh, the world is healing sort of memes recently, it's a fair point that decreased transport has resulted in cleaner air, which will probably be good for a bunch of respiratory problems, and it's had some positive effects. Um, so, I would both predict and hope that teleworking will be increased and business travel at the least will be decreased. Um, Increased automation, that was something that was coming anyway, but with the risks being faced by delivery people, by people working in shops, I think we're going to see a big, big push for it over the coming couple of years. The McDonald's self-service checkouts, I think, will be bolstered by automated uh, burger flipping bots. Self-driving cars will get a big push, and I would not be surprised if a lot of the kind of developments that were promised for the coming years will be pretty rapidly front loaded into the next year to 2 years. I think we're going to see face masks normalized in the developed world. I say developed world, obviously places like Taiwan and Japan are developed countries. That's uh, probably a bit of cultural bias slipping in there. But in the Western world, uh, I think we're going to see a lot more of. I don't know what's up with this bloody thing. Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, so face masks, particularly the kind of surgical masks, I think we'll see a lot more of just day to day in the West. Though one thing I'll be interested to see is whether more surgical masks, which generally protect others better from your coughing rather than protecting you, and versus N95 masks, which are good at protecting you, but not so good at protecting others. I wouldn't be surprised if in the West we see more N95 masks than is typical on the streets of, Tokyo or Seoul. Um, I suspect our more individualist focus to the culture might lead to more selfish behaviour. But that one I would say is a lower confidence prediction. I'm highly confident that face masks will be more normalised. And I'm also highly confident that the route to market for a variety of medical treatments is going to be relaxed. As I was mentioning earlier, the rate of research going on at the moment is just astronomical, and we've seen some of the advances that we can make, particularly in terms of vaccine development, in a tenth of the time it would have normally taken. Getting from conception of a vaccine trial to kicking it off would normally be a multi-year process, and the teams at well, the Oxford team and a bunch of others have gotten it done in a matter of a couple of months, which is staggering, and I think is going to really provide an impetus for policymakers and scientists to look at their processes and try to work out how they can be sped up. Um, because obviously there is a kind of wartime footing element to this, and we probably shouldn't normally be rushing things quite as much because, as I just went on a whole long rant about, that can lead to uh, unreliable evidence. But there are also a lot of stages in vaccine and drug development that can definitely be shortened, and I would be surprised if we don't see some efforts towards that. Um, I'm less confident about these ones, but I would still be willing to make the prediction. Um, so, uh, more pandemic control technology and more serious global biorisk standards. This is admittedly more than a hope than a prediction, since it is a collective action problem that requires coordination between governments all over the world. Not so much the control technology, but to some degree, but particularly the biorisk standards. Um, as I will cover in future streams, I think that biological risk, that particularly bioterrorism is, or accidental release of engineered viruses, is probably the biggest threat facing our species currently. And while the coronavirus was not engineered in a lab, uh, the next great pandemic might be, and it potentially could wipe out our species. And I'd hope that this little jolt has will encourage people, will encourage policymakers to think a bit more seriously about the threat of diseases causing massive, massive disruption. I think a lot of people will realise that this is not a not a case where a stitch in time could have saved nine, but where a stitch in time could have saved 999. Uh, I would be willing to bet that the response to the coronavirus pandemic is going to be at least three orders of magnitude the cost that it would have taken for governments uh, to avoid the pandemic altogether just by improving biorisk procedures. And maybe not at least three, at least two, minimum of two. I will make a confident prediction that'll be that kind of disparity, and a lower confidence prediction that this is going to lead to some kind of serious action. Um, I'm also moderately confident that there will be somewhat of a backlash against globalization, and that a lot of businesses will move out of China. This is significantly less inside my kind of area of specialty, but I think that there's a definite risk of not just travel dropping, but economic interaction between countries dropping, and a very negative response, both in kind of the popular mindset and among uh, governments and corporations about doing business with and in China. The degree to which that'll be justified, I don't know. I certainly don't think the backlash against globalization will be justified, but I think it's a distinct risk, and one that I'm not looking forward to, not least because backlashes against globalization are fertile ground for populists of every stripe, and fuck populism. That's my courageous, brave take of today. And finally, on a more positive note, I think that the pandemic could well, again, moderate confidence, could well pave the way for two policies that I'm particularly positive about, which are drug legalization and universal basic income. Though I'm less confident about the value of UBI, I think it's a compelling idea that we should do more research on. Legalization, or at least decriminalization of most drugs. Um, I say most because I don't think antibiotics should necessarily be in there, but of all recreational drugs, I will say, should be undertaken. And I've seen various reports of Lebanon, and I think one or two South American countries, maybe. Certainly, several localities are looking at reducing restrictions on recreational drugs in order to boost tax revenues in the wake of this current massive economic devastation, and as a way of reducing burden on healthcare services, because the evidence is really stacking up that uh, reducing the restrictions on drugs, making them more accessible and accessible via some sort of legal manufacturing route, is much, much better than just forcing people to get them on the streets. Um, and there's been some vague rumblings for several years now, what with the US, parts of the US legalizing cannabis, and discussing, Canada's had some, particularly British Columbia has had some massive success with uh, prescribing opioid maintenance therapies and making it less legally problematic to get caught with drugs. And it's just such a no-brainer policy that I think the shift in perspective that the pandemic is affording us is likely to make a bit more attractive. And on the UBI front, it does amuse me how much everyone was skeptical of Andrew Yang. Not that I was ever really Yang Gang, but everyone was very skeptical of Andrew Yang a mere few months ago and his universal basic income plans, and now it's being much, much more seriously considered. So I wouldn't predict that everywhere is going to implement it, but let's say at least a couple of European countries, and um, I suspect it'll drive a gradual uptake of UBI or negative income tax or a similar kind of policies. So that's my kind of happy note to end on. Um, Many may die, but we might have legal drugs and free money, so yay. Um, yeah, I think I might try to do something a little bit more upbeat for for Monday's episode, since while this is all very interesting and compelling stuff, or interesting for me to research, I don't know whether you found it interesting. Hopefully you have. But while this is interesting for me to research, it is definitely a little bit depressing. So yeah, I'll probably look into something a bit more happy for Monday. And then, as I mentioned earlier, Wednesday we have the absolutely wonderful Anders Sandberg coming on to speak about super cool far future stuff. You know, if we survive the next couple of centuries, what wondrous vistas await for our species. So if you do have any ideas for topics for me to cover, or questions, feedback, anything like that, please do get in touch. I'm on Twitch, as you can see, or YouTube as Post Normal, and I should probably set up a Gmail account with that, shouldn't I? Nobody steal that Gmail account. Um, but yeah, or just email me laurie.pycroft@gmail.com or whatever. So yeah, thank you very much for listening. I, as always, welcome feedback, and I hope you all have a lovely weekend or coming days whenever you're watching this back. So, ta-ta for now, and I'll see you all later. Bye.